7 years of marriage summed up in one sentence. Sitting at the end of that dining table, among people I barely knew, I heard the words that marked the end of everything we had built together. That night started like so many others. Jessica insisted we go to dinner at her friend Camila's place, one of those gatherings she loved and I put up with out of obligation. Our downtown apartment was about a 30-minute drive away, which was enough time for Jessica to give me all the instructions on how I should behave. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. Remember to compliment the decor, she said while I was driving. And don't talk about work all night. Nobody wants to hear about insurance contracts. I just nodded silently, like I'd been doing for months. Actually, for years. When did I become this guy who just agrees? I can't really say when our dynamic changed. Maybe it happened gradually, like water slowly wearing away stone. Camila's place was exactly as I imagined. Impeccably decorated, noisy, and full of people who looked like they had stepped out of a fashion catalog. Jessica immediately blended into the scene while I stayed on the sidelines, holding a wine glass that I barely touched. "Michael, come meet Carlos and Patricia." Jessica called me at one point, but then she left me in the middle of the conversation when she saw other, more interesting people. Carlos tried to be friendly, but the conversation died quickly. I ended up sitting away from Jessica during dinner, which was not unusual. She never made a point of sitting next to me on these occasions. It was during dessert that it happened. I was pouring a little extra water when I heard Renata's voice, one of Jessica's close friends, loud enough for several people to hear. "Then, how's married life? Still in your honeymoon phase after all this time?" Her tone was teasing, full of that intimacy friends share. What came next froze something inside me. Jessica laughed, a light, carefree laugh, as if she were just commenting on the weather. "Please, he's just my roommate at this point." The whole table burst into laughter. Everyone except me. No one noticed my silence or the way my hand clenched the napkin under the table. I kept eating a dessert that I no longer even tasted. At that moment, everything made sense. The separate dinners, the shallow conversations, the sex that had stopped months ago, the casual indifference with which she treated my attempts at closeness. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was just a detail, an object in the house, like the sofa or the refrigerator. On the way home, the silence in the car was heavy. Jessica was fiddling with her cell phone and occasionally commenting on how fun the night had been. When I parked at the building, I finally gathered the courage. "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "Why did you tell your friends that I'm just your roommate?" Jessica looked surprised, then irritated. "Were you listening to my conversation?" "I wasn't spying, Jessica." Half the table heard. "I heard it." She rolled her eyes and opened the car door. "It was just a joke, Michael. Don't be so sensitive." "A joke? About our marriage. Everyone jokes about marriage. It's normal." Her tone was the same one she would use to explain something obvious to a child. "You're overreacting." We got into the apartment in silence. While Jessica went straight to the bathroom, I stayed in the living room looking at our wedding photos on the shelf. Frozen smiles of two people I barely recognized. When she came out of the shower, I tried again. "I don't think I'm overreacting by feeling hurt when my wife says I'm just a roommate." "Oh my God, Michael, still on that?" "It was a joke among friends." "Do you want me to apologize for something so silly?" The way she spoke and her complete lack of empathy or understanding, it was then I realized. It wasn't a joke. It was a truth disguised as humor. Jessica really saw me as just someone sharing her space. Someone to help with the bills, but not a partner. "I don't want an apology," I replied. "I just wanted to know when I stopped being your husband." She sighed, that sigh of someone too tired for a conversation. "You're being dramatic. I'm going to sleep." And so, without any resolution, she went to the bedroom. I stayed up all night, reliving not just that evening, but the past few years. Every time she canceled our plans, every unanswered message, every forgotten anniversary. The distance that grew between us, first in centimeters and then in miles. Jessica had given up on our marriage a long time ago. And that night, for the first time, I gave up too. In the days that followed, I maintained an outward appearance of normalcy. I left for work, came back at the usual time, and did my household chores. Jessica seemed relieved that I no longer brought up that dinner conversation. To her, the matter was closed, just like so many other disagreements we had swept under the rug. But something had changed inside me. I started to look at our routine with different eyes. Jessica rarely had dinner with me, always busy with some commitment with friends or working late. When we were together in the apartment, she spent most of her time in the bedroom while I stayed in the living room. Our weekends had become an exercise in shared loneliness, her on the phone and me reading or watching something. We had become exactly what she said, roommates splitting the bills and occasionally crossing paths. On Wednesday, during my lunch break, I called a real estate agent. By the end of the day, I had visited 2 apartments for rent. The second one was small but cozy, a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen in a quiet neighborhood about 40 minutes from the office. I signed the lease on the spot. On the way home, I stopped at a department store and bought the basics: some kitchen utensils, towels, a set of sheets. The purchases went into the trunk of the car, my little secret. The next day during work, I opened a new bank account. I transferred part of my savings, leaving in the joint marriage fund the amount needed to cover half of the expenses for the next 3 months. I calculated in my head how much each bill would cost, how much Jessica would need to keep the apartment on her own. Even though I knew she earned well as a marketing manager, I felt that responsibility. Maybe it was a final act of consideration or just a reflection of the man I had always been, the one who cares, even when he shouldn't. Over the weekend, while Jessica attended a workshop that lasted all day, I started packing my stuff. It was surprisingly easy to figure out what really mattered. Clothes, some books, personal documents, old photographs, mostly from before I met Jessica. Items carrying memories I wanted to preserve. There were gifts she had given me over the years. A birthday watch, an imported tie, books I never read. I left all of them behind, not out of anger or spite, but because they belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. During the following week, each day, I discreetly took a few things to the new apartment. A suitcase here, a box there. Jessica hardly even noticed the empty spaces that began appearing in the closet, on the shelf, in the dresser drawer. Maybe because she rarely paid attention to me or my things. On Friday, 10 days after dinner, I was ready. My new place already had the basics to welcome me. It still had a long way to go before it felt comfortable, but it was enough to start over. That morning, before leaving for work, I watched Jessica having her coffee, absorbed in her phone as always. "Are you going to be home late today?" I asked casually. "Probably. We have that campaign to finish, and then I'm going out with the office crew." She didn't even look up from the screen. "Don't wait for dinner." "All right. Have a good day." I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should say something more. But what? 7 years together, and I couldn't come up with a proper farewell. Or maybe the real goodbye had happened a long time ago, without us even noticing. At work, I kept to my normal routine, even though my mind was somewhere else. I answered emails, participated in meetings, and advised clients about insurance policies. No one noticed anything different. I had always been good at hiding my feelings, maybe too good, which was another reason I had become invisible to my wife. At the end of the day, I didn't take my usual route home. I drove to my new address, parked in the spot designated for my apartment, and felt a mix of anxiety and relief as I opened the door and stepped into that space which, even though practically empty, felt cozier than the home I had shared with Jessica for years. That night, sitting on the floor of my new apartment with only an air mattress and a makeshift lamp, I wrote a letter to Jessica. It wasn't filled with anger or accusations. I calmly explained that I had decided to move on, that the marriage had effectively ended a long time ago. I mentioned the money I left for the expenses over the next few months and asked her to contact me only when she was ready to talk about the practical details of the separation. I didn't mention the dinner or the comment about just a roommate. There was no need. It had been only the spark, not the cause. I left the letter on the living room table along with my wedding ring. The first nights in the new apartment were strange. The silence was different. It wasn't that tense silence that hung between Jessica and me, but a light, almost comforting quiet. It took me a while to get used to sleeping alone again, to not hearing the sound of the door when she came home late, to not waiting for someone who was never really there. Jessica took 3 days to notice that I was gone. On Monday night, when I was already setting up my little space with some basic used furniture I had bought, I received the first message from her. "Where are you? Your stuff is gone." Just like that. No concern, no questions about whether I was okay, only the fact that I wasn't there anymore, as if noticing the absence of an object. I replied briefly, confirming that I had moved and asking her to read the letter I left. She did not reply that night. The next morning, a flood of messages came. Some confused, others angry. "Why didn't you talk to me before? How could you just leave like that? This is totally immature." At no point did she say she missed me or ask me to come back. Her concerns were practical. How we would pay the bills, what we would tell friends and family, who would keep which pieces of furniture. "You can't just abandon the apartment," she wrote. "We have a lease and financial commitments." I explained about the money I left, enough to cover my part for 3 months. I thought it was a fair deal so that she could reorganize or find a smaller place if she preferred. "That's not fair," she replied. "You're leaving me to handle everything on my own." I couldn't help but see the irony. I had been invisible to her for so long, and now that my absence was causing practical problems, she finally took notice. Not out of love or missing me, but because of bills to pay and explanations to give. In the following days, Jessica's messages swung between anger and negotiation. There was never a sincere request to talk about our relationship, only discussions about the logistical details of the separation. It confirmed what I already knew. Our marriage had ended long before I walked out the door. A week after I left, she asked me to come by and pick up the rest of my things. We arranged a time when she would be out to avoid an awkward encounter. I entered what had been my home for years with the strange feeling of being a visitor. The apartment seemed smaller, messier. I noticed that Jessica had started spreading her things into the spaces that used to be mine. It was as if she were trying to fill the voids I had left, asserting her presence in every corner. I gathered the few items that were still mine, some documents, books, personal objects that I hadn't managed to grab the first time. In less than an hour, nothing of mine remained there. Before leaving, I looked one last time at what used to be our living room, our bedroom, our kitchen. I didn't feel nostalgic, just a quiet certainty that I was doing the right thing. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and closed the door. In the weeks that followed, I built a new routine with a freedom I had forgotten existed. My little apartment, once empty and impersonal, started to gain personality. I bought a wooden table at a thrift store, some shelves for my books, and a comfortable sofa where I spend hours reading or watching documentaries that Jessica used to find boring. I painted the walls in a soft shade of blue, something I had always wanted to do in our old apartment, but which Jessica always postponed because we could never agree on a color. Small choices that once felt insignificant now carried a special weight. They were all mine, without the need for negotiation or compromise. At work, I began to stand out more. As if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, I felt more confident in meetings and more creative in the solutions I proposed to clients. My boss noticed the change and offered me a project I had been eyeing for months, one that involved restructuring an important department. "You seem different," a colleague remarked during lunch. "Lighter, you know." I smiled without going into details about my separation. Very few people at the office knew, and I prefer to keep it that way for now. Not out of shame or denial, but because I was enjoying this transition as something completely my own. Meanwhile, communication with Jessica became increasingly sparse and strictly practical. She sent messages about mail arriving in my name, about the legal separation process we had started, about the final division of assets. The tone was always formal, as if we were really just ex-roommates settling administrative issues. About 2 months after I left, I received a different message. Jessica was asking if we could meet to talk. I suggested a neutral coffee spot downtown. When I arrived, she was already there, looking tired and a bit thinner than I remembered. "Thanks for coming," she said while avoiding my direct gaze. "I know I haven't been the easiest person to deal with lately." I ordered a coffee while she nervously fiddled with her water glass. "The landlord raised the rent," she continued. "I can't keep the apartment on my own." This was not a conversation about reconciliation or about what went wrong in our marriage. It was about money, about the stark reality she was finally facing. "I'm looking for a smaller place," she added. "Maybe you could help out a little more until I get settled?" I looked at Jessica, really looked, try to find a trace of the woman I fell in love with years ago. I saw someone who seemed lost, not because of my absence, but because of the consequences it had on her practical life. Part of me wanted to help, the same protective instinct that had kept me in that marriage for so long, even when there was no connection left. Already left my shares, we agreed. Jessica, 3 months of expenses, ending next month. It was a fair arrangement. She nodded, visibly disappointed, but not surprised. "How are you?" I asked, genuinely interested. "Honestly, not so well." She sighed. "Work is more intense than ever. I'm searching for an apartment in my free time, and all my friends are busy with their own lives. It's like everything is falling apart at once." There was a moment of silence. I could have said a lot about how I felt emotionally abandoned long before I physically left, about how her priorities always seemed somewhere other than our marriage. But looking at her now, I realized there was no more anger or hurt, just lingering tiredness and a bit of compassion. "You're going to adapt," I finally said. "You have always been independent and determined." Jessica looked surprised by the comment, as if she had been expecting resentment. Maybe part of her wished I was still emotionally invested enough to be angry. "You seem okay," she observed. "Better than I expected." "I'm fine. Different, but fine." Our conversation didn't last much longer. Before we said goodbye, she hesitated as if she wanted to say something important. But the moment passed, and all we exchanged was a brief "take care" before going our separate ways. Later that afternoon, back in my apartment, I thought about our meeting. Jessica never mentioned the comment about being just a roommate that had triggered my decision to leave. Maybe she didn't remember, or maybe she didn't consider it significant enough for an apology. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. The following week, I got a call from Paolo, an old friend I hadn't kept in touch with for years. Like so many other things in my marriage, my circle of friends had gradually shrunk, adapting to Jessica's social preferences. "I heard from a mutual friend that you and Jessica have separated," he said. "It's okay if you don't want to talk about it." I surprised myself by talking openly about the end of my marriage, without bitterness or embarrassment. Paolo invited me to a happy hour with some old friends, and I accepted without hesitation, something that would have made me anxious months ago. At the get-together, I reconnected with people who had been part of my life before Jessica. We reminisced, laughed about old stories, talked about the present, and made plans for future meetups. I realized I had built a kind of cocoon around my marriage, gradually isolating myself from my own social life. Now, that cocoon was breaking apart, and I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been asleep. I started picking up new interests. I enrolled in a photography course, a hobby I'd always wanted to explore but never found time for. I began attending a running group on Sunday mornings. I tried restaurants serving cuisines that Jessica used to hate, small freedoms that, together, built a new sense of identity. 3 months after our separation, Jessica sent a message saying that she had found a smaller apartment and was moving. She asked if I would like to keep some furniture that she couldn't take. I politely declined. My space was already complete with pieces I had chosen carefully that reflected who I was now. Occasionally, I still thought about our marriage, trying to pinpoint exactly when we started drifting apart. There were no huge fights, dramatic betrayals, or traumatic events. Just a gradual distancing, almost imperceptible, until we became strangers sharing an address. One day, while going through my mail, I found the final divorce papers my lawyer had sent for me to sign. I sat on my apartment's balcony, a cup of tea by my side, and read every page carefully. The terms were fair, with no disputes over assets or money. I signed every document with a surprising sense of peace. Later that afternoon, I walked to the post office to send off the papers. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the city, and I felt an unexpected wave of gratitude. Not for the separation itself, but for the clarity it brought. For finally recognizing my own worth, and for having the courage to look for something better. Not necessarily another relationship, but a life that belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, I ran into Jessica by chance at a cafe. She was with a coworker, absorbed in a discussion about a project. Our eyes met briefly, and we exchanged polite nods from a distance. Equals, 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 equals. There was no awkward feeling anymore, just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who once shared part of their lives and were now going separate ways. That night, sitting on my sofa and flipping through a photo album filled mostly with images of my new adventures and rekindled friendships, I thought about how our marriage had ended. There wasn't a huge final confrontation, no dramatic scene of accusations or tears. There was no cathartic final moment like in the movies. Instead, there was a quiet exit, a personal decision to no longer live in a space, both physical and emotional, where I had become invisible. There was a certain dignity in that choice, a silent affirmation of my own worth. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Maria, a photographer I had met in the course with whom I had developed a friendship over the past few months. She was inviting me to an exhibition event over the weekend, something I knew would interest me. I accepted the invitation with a smile as I hung up. I didn't know what the future held, if I would find another love, if I would be alone for a while, or if I would rediscover parts of myself that had lain dormant during my marriage. What I didn't know for sure was that for the first time in a long while, I was truly present in my own life. The most important revelation was not that Jessica saw me as just a roommate. It was realizing that I deserved so much more for myself above all. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. That conversation overheard during dinner wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the start of a new beginning. A quiet new beginning, without announcements or confrontations, built day by day with small choices that said, I'm here, I exist fully, and my life has value even when, especially when, no one else is watching. And in that quiet personal revolution, I found not only a new apartment, but also a home within myself.